Hi there, my name is Simone and I have just started my YouTube channel. I'm calling it Sim Sews, but I've been teaching kids sewing for the past 7 years through my business Kids Culture, and I made some sewing kits that some people have bought during this time of lockdown. We're all isolated and I can't conduct my classes. So here I am to show you today an introduction to sewing and some tips on how to get started. So in some of my projects, you might need just regular cotton, which is one strand of cotton. Other projects you will need wool, and as you can see that is threaded through a much larger needle. And then you might have been provided with some embroidery thread, such as this, which is lovely thick embroidery thread. It's made up of 6 strands, and in most of the projects you'll be asked to separate your embroidery floss, it's called, into 2 or 3 threads. This way you will get more, your thread will go a lot further. It can be a bit tricky to separate. Take your time and be careful not to get in a tangle, as I am right here. Just be patient. That's what it's all about. It's all about being patient, taking your time. If you get in a tangle or you do a wrong stitch, just unpick it. Don't pull too hard, otherwise you'll get into a bigger tangle. But here we go. I've separated my cotton. This is into 3 strands, and I'm going to show you next how to generally thread your needle. I like to hold mine in my left hand, and I hold the thread quite close to the end, sometimes even closer. I need to give it a little bit of a twirl to bring all the threads together. Sometimes you need to wet the ends, that helps stick the threads together. I hold my thread, like I said, very close to the ends, almost pinching it, and I take my needle in my right hand, and looking through the eye, I place it on top of the thread and push that thread through, and here we go, we've got our needle threaded. So normally the embroidery thread, I will need to tie a knot at this end, which can sometimes be a bit tricky for kids. So what we'll do is do a couple of stitches to reinforce that at the beginning to avoid having to do a knot. Another trick or thing to keep in mind is when you're sewing to hold your thread and your needle over the eye. This way, when you're pulling at the end, it's not going to unthread each time you're pulling your thread through. We just have a nice little tail there, keeping it threaded. So remind yourself to hold on to your needle over the eye, and that way you won't unthread it every time and have to rethread it, which can be a bit tiring. So again, we wet it just in case it's getting a bit shaggy at the end. Hold it very close to the end. Get your needle and place it over the thread like so. Make sure all the threads come through, otherwise it won't thread nicely. When I'm using my single strand thread, I will often pull the thread all the way to meet the end to create a double thread. That's another way of threading, and you would tie a knot at the end here to secure that as well. And it's all the same really. The wool, the embroidery thread, or you might have your single strand cotton, which you normally use in a sewing machine. So let's get started. Since I'm here with my embroidery thread, I'm going to first demonstrate to you how to get started. This is my flower project, which is sew, and this is a nice project just to practice your straight sewing, reinforce it. So I've started at the back. I'm threading my needle through the fabric and bringing it to the front. Since I haven't tied a knot, I need to reinforce this. I don't want to pull it all the way through, as you can see, otherwise all my stitching comes undone. So I've come from the back to the front. I've left a little tail. I'm just coming back to finish off my stitch, but again, if I pull that, it's going to come undone. So I'm just going to quickly do a second stitch over the top, and that way I've reinforced my cotton and my stitching will now not come undone. So we're going to do a straight stitch from back to the front, and then the front to the back. This is your straight stitch, or it could be called a running stitch. So we are going in a straight line here, and that's what we want to do as beginners. Practice going in a straight line, keeping our stitches the same length and the same width apart. We don't want to do one stitch and then start bringing it out widely, doing a very large stitch such as that. So ideally, we want to keep them 1/2 centimetre long perhaps. Sometimes we do them smaller. Sometimes we'll do them as big as 1 centimetre. This particular project, we do this stitch all the way across. And as you can see right now, I'm doing multiple stitches. That's pretty tricky. Once you get the hang of things, you might be doing that. Your stitches may not always be even, but just to do a very fast demonstration here, because this particular project requires gathering. So I won't go all the way here, but just so you know, if you want to gather something, you'll do a running stitch. And then once you get to this side, we don't tie a knot. Instead, we gather up our fabric. And so it can also be called a gather stitch. So this is how we start making our flower. And that's just my demonstration to you how to do a straight stitch, running stitch, gathering stitch, it could be called. The next thing I'd like to show you is overstitching, which you might accidentally do sometimes when you are supposed to be doing a straight stitch. For example, here, you might lose concentration for a minute and you might go over the edge. And in a project such as this where we're gathering, see how I've gone over? That's going to prevent us from being able to gather efficiently. But this generally is an overstitch when you're going over the edge. It is what it sounds like. So look, when you're starting out, you will accidentally do overstitches a lot. And I don't want you to worry about that, because if you're a beginner, it's all about just having fun, learning and enjoying the mistakes and the beauty of whatever happens, not taking it too seriously. So I'm going to demonstrate to you here right now how to do the overstitch. I've got a felt flower heart here, and I want to sew it. I want to applique is what it's called, applique it to my fabric here. And you will need to use this stitch on any of these projects that you might have purchased. Maybe you've got the penguin here. Here you can see the overstitching. Here is the owl. You've got the overstitching here as well. Or perhaps you've got my lovely little dolly. And so as you can see, we've got the straight stitch here. You would use straight stitch or back stitch to do these sections. And here's the overstitch that I'm going to demonstrate to you right now how to do. So it's always good if you can pin what you're sewing so that it doesn't move around. Generally, you would start sewing from the back of your fabric to conceal a knot, which you should have done. In this case, doing a double stitch isn't exactly what you want to do to reinforce things, because we want a really clean finished, or as clean as possible. It won't be necessary to do a I've misplaced my scissors as usual. I should hang them around my neck. So when you're doing this applique and doing your overstitch, so here I've got just my 3 threads of embroidery floss. So I've tied a knot at the back. That's helped reinforce my stitch, and I'm going to do, like my straight stitch, a lovely stitch over the edge there. And but we're going to keep working our way around whatever shape it is that you're sewing. And like your straight stitch, try and keep them the same distance apart and the same length. It's no big deal if you don't. As a beginner, you're going to make mistakes. It's all a lesson in learning how to concentrate on what you're doing until it becomes second nature. So there we go. I've started my overstitching. That's a fairly large size. It's maybe 5 or 6 millimeters long. You can do smaller ones. The whole point is that you are attaching this shape to your background fabric, and it's a lovely decorative stitch. You might accidentally come over the top to do your next stitch, and as you will see, that's not going to work. So luckily, because we've got this tail here, we'll have to undo that now, and you can undo that stitch and rethread and get back on track. Don't worry about that. It's all part of the process, and you will get there as time goes by. Here I am. I've rethreaded. I'm going to continue again. So basically we're going from the back to the front. It's a bit hard doing this, demonstrating to you, but and here we are. So I came from the back to the front. Now I'm going from the front to the back. So that is how you're going to do your overstitch. What do I need to show you next? I can show you how to do the straight stitch again, but now I'm going to use my wool. Perhaps you're doing the rainbow or the family tree wall hangings. As you can see, we've got the straight stitch here, but I've also done a bit of a back stitch if you want to fill in those gaps. Here we've just got the straight stitch, this is my favorite project for beginners. We don't tie any knots at the beginning or the end. We just let the thread hang down. Gives a nice dream catcher effect, and we attach the buttons as we go along. But I'll show you here. So because we got started here, Louis has sewn all the way around his hand, but we want to fill in those gaps now. So it's a basically straight stitch, but it looks like a back stitch, but it's a lot simpler. So what I'll do is I've got my blue thread here, and oops. So this is a much larger needle with a much larger eye, and it's not as sharp, and it's perfect for fabric like this Hessian. And I'll just show you what I'm doing. He's done his straight stitch. I'm going to start from this end here now. I'm going to fill in the gaps. Basically, I'm going to go from the end of this stitch to the beginning of the next one, and that's going to help fill in all those gaps. And that's the easy way of doing a back stitch. You're basically going back in the same direction as from where you came, and that gives us a nice line rather than a broken line that you have with your straight stitch. So look, I hope this has helped you get started, and I will post some more things on that we can sew. For example, we've got these embroidery hoops. This has been done with proper back stitch. That's a bit more complicated. I suggest you get started with your straight stitch and your over stitch. Have fun, and don't take it too seriously, and enjoy the process. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.